Hello. As promised, this is our talk on the origins of yoga uh, by me, Dr. Shyam Ranganathan of Yoga Philosophy. I wanted to provide a little introduction to where yoga comes from, why it is that Indian philosophers dreamt up the idea of yoga, uh, and uh, and and how we can move on from the remarkable insight and philosophical revolution that they started thousands of years ago. Uh, First, I guess it's probably wise for us to. Actually, before I dive into the talk, I just want to state that I know that some people contacted me and they told me that they wanted to watch the talk, but they couldn't do it now. So this will be archived, and certainly if you want to, those of us actually on the talk now want to watch it later on, it'll just be on the Facebook, the Yoga Philosophy page. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the historical material. And the historical material is interesting because um, we usually think of yoga primarily, at least this is the way it's advertised, right, as this exercise in posture, and flow of postures, and maybe sometimes breathing exercises or and maybe meditation conceived as this effort to concentrate or maybe clear one's mind or control one's mind, etc. Right? And these are all uh, limbs of yoga that Patanjali talks about in the Yoga Sutra. But no doubt we come to our appreciation of yoga largely through the influence of a few teachers in not too long ago, the turn of the 20th century, in Mysore, South India. And the leading teacher, of course, is Tirumala Krishnamacharya, who invented a kind of modern uh, practice of yoga, and he had these very influential students such as Patabi Joyce, Iyengar, and then his son Deshakachar, who ended up, spreading through their own distinct styles and lessons that they derived from Krishnamacharya, the practice of yoga as we typically understand it today, and the way in which it's taught in yoga studios around the world. Okay, now Krishnamacharya himself was a student of Patanjali's yoga, and he's reputed to have been a student of traditional Indian philosophy also. So he was deriving his idea of yoga from an earlier tradition, but this earlier tradition, certainly in the case of Patanjali's yoga, isn't uh, isn't primarily a physical exercise. So that's an application of yoga as a physical as a philosophy, right? Working through postures, etc. Uh, right. The original teachings of yoga were philosophical. Now we could go back further to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and the Yoga Sutra was compiled somewhere between 200 CE or 200 BCE, someplace in there. But the ideas of yoga weren't new to the Yoga Sutra, right? And you can find similar ideas in the Bhagavad Gita and in other contemporaneous literature, but it goes back even further, and it goes back further to a shift in thinking in the Indian tradition between an older part of the Vedas and then a later part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about that shift, and then once we understand that shift, we'll be in a position to appreciate how yoga, as we understand it today, is a kind of descendant of that initial project. Okay, so if you go all the way back to the earliest parts of the Vedas, what you have there is a record. So the Vedas is an ancient corpus. It's a collection of texts that was passed down generation after generation, orally, and people would memorize the text verbatim. And It's divided into an earlier part and a later part. The earlier part is comprised of mantras or chants, and they come with brahmanas, which are these books that tell you how to sacrifice. And then, depending upon how you divide it, there's a later part that kind of overlaps. These are the forest books, and they talk a little bit about ritual. But when you get into the forest books, you have the beginnings of the Upanishads, and the Upanishads are the dialogues of the Vedas. And then there's a kind of radical shift. So in the early part, what you have are records of sacrifices to the gods, and the gods are the gods of nature, right? Like the fire, the wind, the sun, and the idea is that in order for us to get the things that we want in life, like health and prosperity, and to avoid the things we don't like disease, or harassment from enemies, you have to provide the gods or the forces of nature something that appeases them. And then when you've appeased them, then you get a break, right? You get a little bit of what you want. Okay, so if you look at the early part of the Vedas, it's filled with chants to these gods that would be used in sacrifices with the hopes of getting something that people want. Now, there's a problem, and it manifests itself in a couple of different ways with this entire paradigm. Okay, and the problem is that the things that we want, okay, let's say, good weather for good crops to grow, or not to catch a disease, or for our enemies to leave us alone. These are things that aren't really in our control, right? We might have some contribution to make to their outcome, but whether we catch a virus or not, or whether our enemies decide to harass us or not, isn't really completely up to us. And so one problem then in thinking about your life as something that has to revolve around doing things to avoid some type of outcome that you don't like, or to gain some outcome that you do like, is that what ends up happening is that you end up doing things with the hopes of some outcome that you really you have like zero control over. So then that calls into question even the point in doing those things in the first place, right? So let's say you thought you had to do a ritual because it would make it rain, right? That only makes sense if you have some kind of input or control over whether it rains. But if there's zero connection between doing the sacrifice and it raining, then it becomes kind of a weirdly pointless exercise, because you're not in control of the outcome, even if you do the sacrifice, right? And of course you could do the test, and you would find out, and no doubt they started noticing it too, like there was no clear causal connection between doing these rituals and getting the things that you want. So, but the philosophical problem is the deeper problem. It's not that they didn't know what sacrifice to do, or what chant to say. The deeper problem is that the outcomes that they wanted were just not in their control. So it wouldn't matter what they did, it would have been ineffective. Okay. Then there's a kind of another problem, a related problem, namely that the things that people want to avoid, let's say you adopt this paradigm, it's a consequentialist paradigm, where you think that the things you should be doing are justified insofar as they bring about some outcome, or they help you avoid something that you don't like. Now, the related problem is that in order to make sense of life this way, you have to understand it in terms of the things you don't want or you don't like. And so you can't ever really get rid of those evils, because they play this important role in making sense of why it is that you do what you do. Okay, so later on in the Western tradition, the philosopher Nietzsche would call this system resentful, or ressentiment in French. And the idea is that when you're resentful, you do things in part because there's something you don't like, and you're doing it in part in spite, but you're not really free from that thing you don't like. Okay, so not only are we not in control of the outcomes, but the evils that we want to avoid are not anything that we can avoid. And so I actually started to look into this issue into the early part of the Vedas, because I was actually asked to write an article, and it showed up in this edited volume called The History of Evil in Antiquity. It's part of a multi-series set, but it's by philosophers and intellectual historians, and each article is about the idea of evil in a different time period or area. And so I was asked to write this article on the Vedas and the Upanishads. And so it was pretty obvious. Lots of people had already noticed that everything was very much motivated in the early Vedas to, avoid the things that people don't like and to get the things that they want. But what they didn't quite catch was that there's a radical shift in the second part, and the radical shift has to do with a dissatisfaction with the paradigm in the first part of the Vedas, right? So the first part of the Vedas tries to motivate us to do things for some ends that we don't control. And then the second part is this radical shift towards the self. Now, why is it that you would start to focus on the self, right? And I think the idea here is that if you start to think about the point of life, not as acquiring things you don't have control over, but in controlling and perfecting the art of living, okay, then whatever happens is going to be a function of your own self-control, right? So then all of a sudden, you've gotten rid of this idea that you have to do things to avoid things you don't like, and you've gotten rid of this problem of outcomes you don't control, because the outcomes of life, if you live by way of focus on the self, right, in the practical challenge of living your life, the outcomes that follow from this are simply a function of your practice, right? So you, in a way, you do have some control over them, right? Not necessarily at first, but by perfecting the practice, then as you perfect the practice, the outcome is just a perfected practice. And if that's your concern, right, then you don't have to worry about outcomes that you don't have any control over. You just stop worrying about outcomes altogether. You just start thinking about living your life in a way that's good for you. Okay, and notice how that just kind of radically shifts the entire challenge of living. Now, when you look to the second part of the Vedas, there are all sorts of little telltale signs that this shift is really what's at base. First of all, there's explicit talk of things like prana, like breath and breathing, which we know is deeply connected to the practice of yoga. There's also the introduction of this idea of Brahman. Now, Brahman is usually treated as like a God concept, and people usually think of Brahman, certainly in the contemporary world, they think about it as this like thing, this like ultimate God that exists, and maybe we're all part of it or maybe we're not. But the actual word means development or expansion. And so when the early Vedic thinkers started thinking about shifting the focus to the self, right, and then they would say things like, and the self is Brahman, or the self, and whether there's one or many selves, they were making a claim about what it is to be an individual. To be an individual is to expand, is to develop. It's not to be stuck or static, right? And so, unfortunately, that aspect gets lost for a variety of reasons in the way this part of the history of Indian philosophy is taught. People often think that it's just this move to this idea of a universal soul or some kind of God concept. And that wasn't at all what was going on. They were really worried about this practical challenge of how you live life successfully, right? And it's at this point when you have a shift to the talk about the self and Brahman or development in the later part of the Vedas, that you also have the introduction, or at least a formal articulation, of yoga, right? And probably the most classic exploration of the idea of yoga is to be found in the Katha Upanishad. Okay, and there's a dialogue that happens between a boy named Nachiketa and the god Death, and in this conversation, Death reveals the teachings of yoga for which seems like the first time, at least from our perspective, given what we have and what survived, this seems to be the earliest telling of the idea. So what happens is Nachiketa is the son of a man who's doing all these sacrifices, right? And so why do you do sacrifices? You do sacrifices to get things. And the man has made this commitment that he's going to sacrifice everything he owns. Okay, now the boy hears this and says, well, who are you going to sacrifice me to? And he says this a few times. The father ignores him, and then finally the father gets annoyed and he responds to death, right? And it's not, he probably didn't really mean it, he was just annoyed, but because he says it in the context of a sacrifice, he has to sacrifice the boy. So there you have it, the boy is sacrificed, and then he goes to the realm of death. But because he died ahead of time, or he's facing death ahead of time, Death wasn't expecting him. So Death isn't at the palace waiting for the little boy to show up. And so Death keeps him waiting for 3 days. And when he returns, he tells the boy that I will give you one, he apologizes for standing him up for 3 days. And he says, I will give you a boon for every day that I stood you up. And so the boy says, well, I want to go back to my father. Death is like, no problem. Boy says, I want to hear, there's this sacrifice that gets you to the basically the Club Med of outcomes of sacrifices, or or at least what was Club Med, or some kind of wonderful vacation a spot. And Death's like, sure, I'll teach you that sacrifice, no problem. And then finally the boy asks, well, I've heard there's this, that after you die, it's not clear what happens to you. Some people think you survive death and other people think you don't. So, which is it? What happens to someone after they die? And so at first Death is reluctant to teach the boy the answer to this question, because he says it's too difficult. Lots of people have tried. They can't understand it. Just ask for something else. And so the boy doesn't give up. He persists. And then finally Death is very impressed and he says, okay, fine, I'll tell you the answer. And he says, first he starts off by complimenting the boy for being interested in Shreya, or control. And he says most foolish people just want pleasurable things or beneficial things. They don't really think about control or controlling their life or being responsible as the most important thing. And then Death provides the following analogy. He says that each one of us is like a chariot, that's the body. And then there are these horses that are the senses. And then there's the mind, that is the reins. And then the charioteer is like the intellect. And wise people employ their intellect to influence their mind to rein in their senses. And people who are able to do this end up in the realm of Vishnu, the god of preservation. Okay, and that means that they avoid trouble. But people who aren't able to do this are led by their senses and then meet with disaster. And he says that not only is the failure to take control of all of these different elements in your life, your mind, your senses, your intellect, to serve your bodily interests, a bad thing. Succeeding or working on doing that so that you rein in your senses and your mind by way of your intellect to serve the interests of your body, that's yoga. Okay? And so that's the first definition of yoga, kind of very worked out philosophical definition of yoga. We get that corresponds to what we end up hearing later on in the tradition. Now, how is this an answer to the question, right? It's an answer to the question that the boy asks in 2 respects, right? So the boy says, well, what happens to you when you die, right? And Death's answer is, well, there's 2 possible ways that this could work out, right? If we fail to confront death ahead of time, like the boy did, right? If we fail to do that, what ends up happening is that death ends up being an event that happens to us. And it's a kind of public event. It's an event. It's a disaster, right? That's the death of our body. That's not a good thing. Or we take control of death. And what is death but a loss of control, right? But when we take control of death, we lose control to ourselves, which is to say we govern ourselves, right? To lose control to yourself is to self-control, because part of you is losing control to the other part that's taking charge. And when we do that, what we do is we're able to navigate a public world safely. So what's the take home? Well, death is this inevitability, but notice it could go one of 2 ways, right? Death can either happen to you or it's something that you take responsibility for. And yoga is what it is to take responsibility for our own death, right? And what we end up doing is we end up losing control to ourselves as a way of living. And this loss of control to ourselves is self-control or yoga. Okay, now what this story does, it does a couple of things. First of all, it sets up subsequent explorations of yoga. So for instance, when we come to the Bhagavad Gita and Krishna is on the battlefield with Arjuna, this is a story that you may know, right? It's a very famous discourse in discussion on yoga. That motif or that scene, right, is explicitly drawing or alluding back to this discussion with death, where the intellect is supposed to kind of take control of everything. And in that case, Krishna, the divine teacher, is the charioteer. So there's a kind of subsequent, later on in the literature, there's this allusion back to this earlier model, which is pretty neat. But it also sets up the teachings, the systematic teachings that we find in the Yoga Sutra by Patañjali, right? What Patañjali does in the Yoga Sutra is provide a very systematic and worked out account of this teachings of yoga, right? And it starts off by suggesting that either we take control of our mind or we don't. Either our mind treats us with respect, or our thoughts are respectful to us, or they're not, right? And we have a role in our own lives that determines how the elements of our lives, our senses, our minds, our body, respects our interests. Okay, so that's in the Yoga Sutra. I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. The other neat thing that we learn from this dialogue of death in the Upanishads. Oh, I see some folks are joining us now. Don't worry, this will be archived. You can watch the whole thing later on. The other neat thing that we learn from this story in the Katha Upanishad is that the self, even though it's not something that we experience, right, it's an important feature of our life, because if we don't take ourselves seriously, right, we will be like people who don't control the horses of their lives and then just allow these horses to drag us into a disastrous circumstance, right? Now, why would these horses do that? Well, the analogy I use is, well, imagine you're driving, a chariot and you've got horses, if you can imagine that. I've never done it, but, myself. But imagine that you could do that, right? And then you're traveling along the road and you see this beautiful vista, beach maybe, yonder with lovely waves, and you want to go to that beach. And so what are you going to do, right? Now, if you're not in control of your senses, what will happen is you'll let your senses just drive you to that goal. But, right, what if you're on a cliff? What if there's a valley in between, right? Simply going towards your destination, being drawn by your senses, would be a disaster, right? You'd get into an accident, you'd fall into the ditch. Really, what you need to do is you need to take charge of those horses, steer everything, your body, yourself, via your mind and intellect, safely to that destination. But that's not a matter of simply being drawn by the things that you're attracted to via your senses, right? That successful arrival at your goal and destination requires a responsible control over the totality of elements that constitute your life. Right now, none of those elements that constitute your life, right, the ones that you have to take control of, right, is exactly the same as you. But notice, if you don't take control of your senses in this analogy, or your mind, or your body, what ends up happening is that you will meet with disaster, right? So the self is this thing in the chariot, so to speak, whose interests are very closely associated with the body. And what yoga teaches us is it teaches us that we need to take responsibility for all the features of our life so that they respect our interests as people. Now, one further interesting thing about this lesson is that this is actually something we share. So even though yoga is really focused on you, the individual, as someone who needs to take charge of their own life so that things go well, right? Each one of us has this interest, right? And so that's actually something we have in common, right? So even though it's a project of our own individual autonomy, understanding the conditions of what it is for any one of us to live well means that we start to understand what's involved in all of us living well, right? And, it's not going to work out for me if I'm, great at steering my chariot, but you're really bad at it, right? So in order for me to live in a world that's safe for me, as someone who's in charge of my own life, right, I have to have a safe world to participate in. But how am I going to do that except for taking some responsibility for the kind of world we live in? And so when you look at the Yoga Sutra, right, Patanjali starts off his 8 limbs of yoga with the Yama rules, and the first commitment of this is ahimsa, or non-harm, right? Before you can even do anything else, you have to be committed to making the world a safe place for you to practice yoga, and that means you end up being responsible for the truth. This is the further teachings of the Yama rules that respect our mutual personal boundaries, right? And respect each other's requirements. And so even though yoga is very much this project that each one of us takes on ourselves, right? In order to get the whole thing off of the ground requires a lot of concern for other people, because really in the end, we share the same interests in our own lordliness. And this comes out in the Yoga Sutra probably more than in the Upanishads, or certainly more than the Katha Upanishad, that dialogue I was just talking about, that what really drives the project, right, is a devotion to this abstract goal, this abstract ideal of lordliness, or the Lord, right? And just as each one of us is a kind of abstraction from our own life, and an abstraction that we have to understand in order to appreciate what we need to take responsibility for in our life, right? The Lord is this kind of higher level abstraction from all of us. It's the ideal of what it is for each one of us to live well, which is to not be constrained by problems of the past, and free to move on in a manner of our own determination, right? And this is something we share. All of that is made, far more explicit and clear in the Yoga Sutra. And so then when we look to the contemporary practice of yoga, right, which is often rooted, or at least the beginning exercise has a lot to do with the physical practice. That's not a deviation so much as an application of this more basic philosophical commitment to the idea that we have to take charge of the elements of our life in a manner that makes it possible for others to do so too. Okay, so if you go all the way back to the beginning and you appreciate the philosophical foundations of yoga, then as you move through the centuries and you look to what's going on today, right, you can see it as a clear descendant of that project. If you start today and kind of go backwards, it's really weird, right? If you start today and try and go backwards, what usually happens is people see yoga as just a few different tricks. You got to do your asana flow, you have to do maybe breath control, and then there's something like mindfulness or meditation you throw in, right? And then you say, well, look, it's really this project of philosophy. And then when you look at these 3 things that people often do as yoga, you say, well, where's the philosophy, right? All I see is people doing their postures and their breathing exercise, and all of that. It does seem kind of disconnected from philosophy, and it can be taught that way. I've certainly seen it taught that way. But if you're going to understand why you bother doing it anyways, right, and why it is that it's an important way to spend your time, all of a sudden these historical strands and the systematic ideas that we find in Patanjali's yoga really come to the fore, right? They start to be clearly very important. Okay, so that's my overview about the origins of yoga. I'm happy to talk about them more. If anybody has any questions, they can certainly share them with me. Okay. I also thought I would take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the course that I'm going to be offering starting the following week on the Yoga Sutra. And so the idea behind this course was to provide a systematic account, an overview of the philosophy of yoga, and we would use the Yoga Sutra as as the basis, right? And the reason why this is really important is that the value that we derive from the practice of yoga has to do with it being an application of this broader project of wise living, right? And yoga isn't reducible to a few tricks that you can learn in a class, right? It's about the totality of the choices that we have to make, and also our interaction with other people and even ourselves, right? There's no part of life that escapes yoga. So often when people ask me, do you practice yoga? I know exactly what they mean, right? They mean, do I do, postural flow? But, I think part of them is also interested in this idea of practicing yoga. And if you really want to unlock the potential that yoga has for you, right? What we need to do is we need to situate all of these things that we understand as yoga within a wider philosophical project of being committed to the practice of yoga. So my goal there, someone's having difficulty connecting. Hope it's worked out. So some of you are having difficulty with the connection. So what I'm hoping is that the archive video will be stronger and a little bit more reliable. I can of course always redo this and send it out as a Facebook post with the YouTube component. Right. So now, that's kind of what I just talked about was the motivation for this course on the Yoga Sutra. Another motivation that I have for doing this is that I've been involved in yoga research and yoga education for a long time, and I have seen that the standards have, in some ways, they fluctuated. Right? I get the sense that when you go back earlier to people like Krishnamacharya, right, there was this deep sense that the practice of yoga was a continuation of these philosophical insights from the early tradition, and then often when it's taught these days, it isn't taught that way, and that's a problem because really, if you don't situate the practice of yoga within the philosophical project, it's just a bunch of movements and words in Sanskrit, right? It's nothing special. It becomes special, right? Because it's an application of your own effort to be the master of your own destiny, right? And that's a philosophical endeavor that involves appreciating ourselves as a kind of philosophical, each one of us as a philosophical being who has a responsibility to their own life. Okay, so my goal then is to help people kind of unlock the original wisdom in the yoga tradition that was taught to us as philosophy. All right, so I hope that I know that there were some connection problems with some people. I hope some of that is being resolved. As I said, I will be archiving this, so I'm sure, or I hope at least, that the archive version is going to be okay. So just a few other little and some answers about this course. So I had some questions sent to me about the course. There was some concern that if you were to try to undertake it, you wouldn't be able to finish it in the time that it's being offered, right? And my solution to this is to just make the material available to you in perpetuity, right? And so the video lectures, that's half of the teachings, those are going to be released on a weekly basis, and you get to watch them at your convenience. And then we will have live call-in virtual tutorials, right? So it would be as though we were in a university class with each other, but it would be virtual. And that would be the students' opportunity to discuss these questions, any questions that they have. And I'll have more than one time set up so that people from their various time zones can tune in. And if for some reason none of those times work for you, you can always send me your questions, and I will answer them, and then they get archived and posted to the class, and then you can view them later. Another question I had was that, I don't know anything about philosophy or yoga. Will this be too difficult for me? Right. So my answer to this is that yoga is always something that you are learning, right? So even though I've been doing this for some time, and I've been conducting research, from the ground up, from original texts, it's not as though I at some point I knew enough about yoga to understand it. Every year I learn more and more about yoga as I reapply myself to the material. So there's no kind of perfect starting point. And I think that's the same as the practice of yoga, right? Like when's a good time to start practicing yoga, right? The whole point is that you're pushing yourself from where you are. But it should be the kind of thing that all of us can practice. And so that's the way I look at my course too, right? It should be a challenge to you, but a challenge that you can take on from wherever you are in your journey, right? And it should be a little challenging, otherwise it wouldn't offer you any opportunity for further growth and learning. But it can't be so crazy that you can't participate, right? So there's this sweet balance that yoga provides us, right? And I've modeled my course after that balance. So you don't require any background knowledge. The other concern that some people have suggested is that, well, I do know something about this, I've studied it before. So one of the reasons, so this might seem like redundant. So one of the reasons that I started researching to yoga was that I was just so overwhelmed and surprised at how many different stories there were out there about what yoga is, right? Every time I picked up a different translation, it would say something different. And so, I was really motivated to try and study it myself in Sanskrit, to read it as a student of philosophy, and to start from there. And so I think that that's something that's missing, right? We have a lot of people who will teach you what their guru taught them, and we have a lot of people who will tell you what the commentaries say, right? But this art of studying yoga as philosophy is kind of missing. And it's missing for a lot of interesting cultural reasons. It's missing in the academy, it's missing out in the general public, in yoga education. But I think one thing that people often don't appreciate is that one of the things that we learn as philosophers is how to read these difficult texts that we don't understand, right? So, the point of the philosophical training allows you this ability to pick up something, you don't understand it, and make sense of it, right? And to do it in a way that's objective, that isn't about projecting what you already believe. So even if you studied the Yoga Sutra a bit before, right, I think there'll be something interesting and challenging for all of us in this offering, because what I'm going to try to do is invite us to deal with the original ideas in the text itself, right? And not because I'm particularly interested in philology, but because I'm really interested in us unpacking these transformative ideas of yoga. All right, so are there any questions out there, any left over that I have not asked or answered? Okay, well, thanks so much for tuning in. I know that it seems that it's been difficult for some folks to stay tuned in because of the internet being what it is, but I hope to connect with you all later, and I wish you all a great weekend. If it's hopefully if it's still going on where you are, if it's almost over or it's over, a good start of the week to where you are, and more yoga philosophy to follow soon. Thanks.